Thank you, Mirjam. That's really always is, I think, the most difficult job on a panel is to be discussant. To be able to wrap it up as brilliantly as you just did. I congratulate you, and I wish I could do that. Couple things. We now have Ahmet Kuru joining us, so he will take questions as well. If you have questions, if you would kindly identify yourself, and if you have a particular organization that you're representing, if you do that as well. So I will also do what the chair gets to normally do and ask a simple question here. It should be pretty easy to answer. When you're looking at these indices, and for instance, Turkey comes in with an index number of 47, is this reflective of a combination of factors? Does it reflect the density of efforts to promote a particular religious orthodoxy or information? And does it also reflect the ability of the state to implement those programs?
Does
the ordinal
RAS,
here, where the United
yes.
States comes in at 0 and Turkey comes in at 47.
Yes. The RAS, so the composite score has as one of its 5 dimensions the enforcement level. Yes.
Okay, so this could reflect, for instance, a high ability of the Turkish state to enforce. Does it also capture non-official, vehicles for transmitting?
Oh, I see. Sorry. Yes. No, this is purely an analysis of the Constitution and legislation. It doesn't look at any
informal
others.
networks
Exactly.
and the like.
Right.
Okay, great.
But the Human Rights Watch civil liberties would include, supposing there are major civil society groups that mobilize and violate other civil society groups' rights, that would be a judgment on the status of civil liberties in that country.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't necessarily, those types of violations are not necessarily coming from the government per se, but they're just fairly broad in the society.
But as an example, for instance, the Diyanet has a particular line that they are going to talk about them writing the sermons every week. But if they were unofficial groups, groups like the Gülen group, if they were having meetings outside, and these would not be necessarily captured within these numbers? No. Okay.
It would be captured if they were systematically engaged in violence, and I've seen very little evidence that they are. But many of the RSS groups in India are systematically engaged in mobilizing violence. And it's going to come up, and the indicators that civil liberties, in this case, are being eroded, but they're being eroded by non-state actors.
Yeah.
And you should capture that. If you're not capturing that, I go to places that are failed states. So, the government may not be doing it because the government is just disappearing, but it's a chaotic place.
Yeah, so just to concretize, the religion and state data set and polity wouldn't capture that.
Mm-hmm.
Violence doesn't go into polity, right? Yeah. But it would come up in the civil rights score among the Freedom House Index.
Right.
So there are
right.
of course different levels of information that go into these 3 indices.
Great, thank you very much. Yes.
Well, my question relates to the status of the Orthodox Patriarch in Istanbul. There were 4 attempts to assassinate him. Turkey changed the law. In order for someone to be replaced as a patriarch there, you have to be born in Turkey and be a Turkish citizen. In other words, it would not allow anybody else from anywhere else to become a patriarch. The next thing is, the theological school has been closed there. So how is it possible, if there are any Greeks anymore there? Actually, there are less than 2,000. In 1955, there were 200,000. And you have a pogrom, and all of them left. They're less than 2,000. So the question is, what is going to happen with the Orthodox Patriarch in Istanbul? What are the chances of its survival? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Starting with the last one, it's hard to predict the future. In general, that's violation of religious rights. And in terms of explanation, I have two explanations. One is that since assertive secularism dominant in Turkey, the state excludes religions from public sphere, or try to. Private religious education has many restrictions. So there are restrictions for Muslim private religious education, Greek Orthodox, or other Christian types. So that's one explanation. Yeah, Turkish state violates the rights of Greek Orthodox in Turkey. The second explanation, in addition to the aspect of secularism, this problem, it's a problem, has also certain things to do with nationalism. Because when the school was closed, it was the time of hot debate about Cyprus issue. So Turkey closed down the school, kind of reaction to Turkish nationalist reaction to Greek Orthodox, and it has a psychological background in terms of the Turkish nationalist perception of Greek Orthodox Church, its school, its connection to Greece and Cyprus. And can I also say a few things about Mirjam's very good questions? So assertive and passive secularism have some positive explanations because both imply a secular state which has two characteristics. One is that it is neutral vis-a-vis to religions, neutral constitutional position. The other is that legislature and courts are secular in a sense that they make the decision without being controlled by religion. In terms of the distinction between these two, assertive secularism has more positive connotation because it has a specific social engineering project to exclude religion from public domain and make it an issue of individual conscience. Passive secularism, kind of more negative definition, because if it doesn't exclude, if it doesn't try to make it an issue of private, then you can call it passive. Regarding to that, yes, I would categorize US and Senegal as passive. They are different, which shows that actually, on the one hand, in a brief summary, assertive and passive secularism are dichotomies, concepts. But in a detailed analysis, there is a continuum, it's a matter of degree, both in terms of comparing cases and in terms of making comparison within cases. For example, in the United States, passive secularism initially implies state neutrality toward Protestant, non-denominational Protestantism throughout the 19th century. Then from the time of the end of Prohibition and Monkey trial, it became state neutrality toward all religions. By the McCarthy era, 50s, it became state neutrality toward monotheism. So passive secularism, even in one single country, has different reconceptualizations and changes, despite the fact that the main pillar stay, which is that state tolerance of religion in public domain. And in this regard, I think Senegal resembles to United States in the 19th century to a certain extent in terms of more state-religion cooperation, because King James Bible was taught in schools in the United States at the time. In terms of Germany and Denmark, Germany is a case between secular state and state with established church. I would define it as secular state, passive secularist. But it has certain things such as collection of texts, church tax, which make it a complicated case. Denmark is a case I would define state with established church rather than a secular state.
Gentleman in the front row here.
Osman Keane from Senegal.
Sorry?
Osman Keane from Senegal.
Excellent. Right here first. Mirjam, PBG, John Jay College. And my question is for Alfred, Stepan, and since you're kind of quantitative.
Do we have a microphone?
All right, so I can speak up. It seems like to be a good secular Muslim country, okay, you have to have non-Muslim minorities. It seems like if you are Muslim majority, you are falling on in terms of success in secularism or accommodation of religion. Is this observation correct? If so, how do you explain that? I mean, from the case in Turkey, I can say that the absence of non-Muslims creates a more oppression of Muslim majority, and we tend to explain animosity towards non-Muslim in terms of intolerance of the majority, but alternative explanations might be that you can mobilize Orientalist structures of oppression when you have Muslim majority or overwhelmingly Muslim majority countries. I hope my question was clear enough. But is there any relationship between failure to achieve a democratic secular state, in the Muslim societies, and the presence of non-Muslims in that country?
But your implicit hypothesis would be that a certain percentage of non-Muslims helps?
Yes. Yeah. The more you have non-Muslims in your country, as a Muslim country, you are more likely to be more democratic and truly secular.
That's an interesting question. Certainly in the Indian case, as early as the first draft of the Indian Constitution in 1928, done by Motilal Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru's father, it was on the table already that at least then, pre-partition India, 24%, maybe a quarter of everybody in India were Muslims. And so if you're thinking of how and so the question on the table is, how are we going to live together? We want to get independent, but we want to be relatively peaceful. So they really had to think about that. So that did force it on the agenda in a way that it might not have been, say, in Senegal. But there you had a 10% Catholic minority, and you also had 4 highly organized Sufi orders. And if you have some countries, you get conflict among the Sufi orders, or if the secular part, for reasons that are interesting. They're never where there was terrific anti-Sufi sentiment in Algeria and for a while in Morocco and in Tunisia, and a real repression in Egypt. There just wasn't. We have to figure out why there wasn't in Senegal, and it's not only because they're the majority, but they worked out something, and then but they were not repressed. The places that have made it, India, Indonesia, even Mali, but certainly Senegal, they've never repressed a major segment of their population on grounds of religion. So that was so something that seemed so normal in Arab North Africa did not seem normal in Indonesia, in India, in Senegal, and I think that's interesting in itself. But it's not a full answer to your question. But there are some things we do know. We do know that if you look at, take a map of religious size of groups for all of Europe, and say which countries never for a day had a fully established church, and those are the countries that have at least a 30% minority in another religion, because then it's just, you don't do it. So Belgium doesn't do it. Holland doesn't do it. Austria doesn't do it. Switzerland doesn't do it. It's just, it's too much conflict. And you're not legitimate enough, and so you don't do it. You may work out segmented pluralism, as in Switzerland. You say, in this canton, if you're 90% Protestant, fine, you can do that. 9% Catholic, you do that. And of course, Belgium works because of segmented pluralism. And the only place that's where, on language side, where you get a lot of French and Walloon speakers is right on the suburbs of Brussels, and that's where all the fighting is. That's the most conflict. So it's not for people who are multicultural communitarians. This isn't good news. I mean, what I'm saying is segmented pluralism is part of peace inducement in many of these places, and unless you work out some totally different strategy, which a number of cases have. But that's
okay. The gentleman from Senegal.
And Alfred Stepan very, very insightful. And in particular, I believe that they correct misconceptions about Islam being inherently undemocratic or Islamic movements not being able to play the rules of the democratic game. Now, I was invited by Alfred Stepan to make some comments about Senegal, which I will do before asking the question. The first, it's about the paradoxes of Senegalese Senegalese experience of secularism or even of the spread of Islam. The first is that Islam spread in the region, its spread was very gradual and lasted almost 1,000 years. But during the 60 years or so of French colonial rule, more people converted to Islam than during the 9 preceding centuries. So colonial rule was really the period of the fastest growth of Islam in Senegal. The second paradox is that much as people are Sufi, 90% or close to that, and they venerate the Sufi orders. However, whenever Sufi orders or Sufi leaders created political parties to contest in elections, they were badly defeated. So my question is, because it seems as if the people arbitrate the twin toleration. So my question to you, Stepan, is the twin toleration something that political and religious elites negotiate, or is it arbitrated by the people? So that's the question that I have for you.
Okay. I don't privilege arbitration. You get in a subway, and there's not much space. Nobody talks, hardly any eye contact. Both people move over and create some space. I mean, this is a normal... So the social histories of central India are filled with these types of unspoken, unnegotiated accommodations to make life a bit better for everybody. So I think as political scientists, and particularly international relations theorists, we overprivilege formal rational interest, negotiation, bargaining, and so on. And if people have been living together for thousands of years, sometimes peacefully and sometimes not, and value living together peacefully, people develop a repertoire of signs of respect, of accommodation that may be silent. And your case in Senegal, for me, struck me as Amadou Bamba had no negotiations. The only thing he did was wrote that very important letter to his own followers saying, you know what? In the last 20 years, we've done pretty well here. We've actually, as precisely as he said, we've grown. We have more members. We have more religious establishments. We've lived in peace. And implicitly, what he's saying is, there's no need for a jihad, and I'm not going to lead it. Okay? And the French never say, oh, we totally accept this, but they begin to say, well, if we're ever going to develop a peanut industry in the central there, maybe we should build a railroad line right up to Mali. And then maybe who's ever around there, in this case, Sufi orders were there. Well, they can develop this land, and so it's not negotiated. It's a statement with huge implications for the relative prosperity of that group. So I don't think as political scientists or analysts of history, we should insist on conscious negotiation when in fact both sides can understand what's involved in making things better and also contemplating alternative futures. So for Bamba, alternative future was jihad into the 4 coastal cities. He didn't feel that was necessary and he didn't want it. And the alternative future for the French, they could go up the rivers and that wasn't too costly. But going in the center, and he said it's been a period of recent conversion because it used to be traditional African kingdoms, and they were disappearing. So the new people who emerged were Sufis, but they built on a lot of traditional rituals. So the sites looked the same, the dancing and maybe much of the music, in the same way of a ceremony. It had a Sufi dimension, but they were building on something that people felt comfortable with. So I don't think we have to talk about formal negotiation. As a matter of fact, it's probably better. I mean, I've been rector and president of a university and dean. Anytime I have to formally negotiate, I've already screwed up. A good rector or a good dean is watching things, and people, you're anticipating, you're talking to people ahead of time. So the time it gets to a formal meeting, then I've made 10 mistakes already. And a lot of politics, particularly ethnic politics, is like that.
Maybe this will be the beginning of the number 1 train process. Professor Yaldan, did you have a question?
No, it wasn't a question. Well, it was a true question. I am
concerned about using Senegal as an example, where you have a very important colonial history. It's my anthropologist's hat which is bothering me. You have a colonial history with a very complex society, with kings and traditional African groups and so on, into which comes the French colonial regime, and the very dynamic situation about religious convergence, conversion, and so on, whether that's at all comparable with India. I mean, a world of difference. India, what about partition? What happened? Devastating events.
Okay, partition was terrible, but the colonial strategy was very similar, in the sense that England, and they had different. Hey, you can have different strategies in different places, but they arrived, and just like Akbar, 600 years before, 300 years before them, looked around and they realized that they're trying to rule a place where they hardly have one person per 400,000 or something, and they really better think about it. So they, among other things, they said they adopted a policy of not interfering much with religion in many places. So there were about 580 principalities when they arrived. There were 580 principalities when they left. And the principalities, the tradition is whether you were Buddhist or Hindu or Mughal, you supported all the religions. So a good principality in religion, as from Akbar, you supported all the religions. So this part of this respect all, support all religions, this is the way minorities ruled. And that's why there's a lot in common with Karen Barkey's book, Empire of Difference, which is a magnificent book, which I had the pleasure of reading and was required reading for my class. So rulers are responding. So the British, they were always worried that missionaries were going to push things too far and cause some complications. So they accepted a lot of difference. Where they overplayed it, and there's been endless writing about this, is by the subaltern historians, particularly for the Madras presidency, now called Tamil Nadu. The British came in and felt they had to your phrase of mapping, not mapping, what's legibility. To make it legible, they had to figure out who was really in charge. Well, they made some mistakes. They really thought the Brahmins were totally in charge around the places. Well, the Brahmins were hated in South India. So they figured out that Brahmins were in charge, and then you started the first major university, one of the most important in all of India. And then they had judges, all right? They put about 3/4, the Brahmins are less than 5% of the population in South India, and less than 3% speak Hindi. I mean, the people in Dravidistan. So in Dravidistan, the British misinterpret the legibility and map onto something that the Brahmins are really important. Well, then they created the Dravidistan movement. So that was angry about this. They wanted to get out of India, and they burned the Indian constitution. They burned the Indian flag. Then it took 30 years of brilliant reconstruction where you allowed the Tamil language to be recognized. You allowed people in the Tamil language and in every one of the states. There are 15 states that are managed in different languages, 13 of which have their own script, as you know. A great Sri Lanka expert on a lot of things. So this is an amazing form. So I think Britain, the tradition, whether it's from Akbar or Ashoka. Now, to say that you have a usable past doesn't mean it's a continuous past. It means it's a usable past. So Ashoka, that's a usable past. So when you go to walk into the Indian Museum in Delhi, what's the first thing you see? Well, outside of it, you see one of Ashoka's, not Akbar, Ashoka, a big pillar. And what does he say? Never speak too much about your own religion to other people. Just saying, that's there. That's a usable past. What does Akbar do? Yeah, well, we're a really minority. We're just coming in here on horseback and so on, and we're charging Hindus 4 times more tax than Muslims. This is not smart. Let's just even it out. And why don't we? Muslims don't know enough about this Farsi literature. Let's translate a lot of the Farsi literature. These are huge. This is consistent with recognizing 11 minority holidays. So there was something there, but people had to work on it. But when a March of Dissent occasionally cherry picks, and then it leaves the idea that all of these good ideas have always been there. They haven't been all there. It's when Gandhi starts thinking about what can I use? Yeah, I can use this, I can use that, and put it together in a new way. Now, your point of, I'll answer your question of whether principal distance, where I stand on that, and am I communitarian, and would that make me illiberal? First of all, I wouldn't care if I was illiberal. I'm always democratic in the sense that a lot of solutions that are horrendous in politics are illiberal, but they're peacemaking and democracy sustaining. You know, and a lot of ending civil wars are deals like that. So I'm not averse to that. And I don't believe that every single right. I believe that individuals are the bearer of human rights. I do not believe that Juan Linz and I do not know of any of the 17 long democratic struggles that we've studied. Any of them did not involve some group that was being marginalized and having to fight for the respect of that group. And finally, when you exercise your right to be able to speak in Kurdish or whatever, that's an individual right. But you win those rights. If you're Russian speaking and you want to speak Russian in Estonia, you're going to have to fight and win it as a Russian group. Later, you have the right to have a Russian television. And if some liberal wants to say that's an individual right, fine. But how you win it collectively. So I call it collective goods. And being able to speak in your own language is a collective good for a large group of people. And I don't see it violates individualism, but if it did violate individualism, I wouldn't care. And I think I feel this is a hegemonic overreach of liberal political theory that is actually bad democratic analysis. And it's very bad history. And it's very American, Anglo-Saxon. Now, in the question of whether the principle of distance, I've taken a lot of that into my own thinking. I've gone about a month a year to India for the last 10 years, and I'm going to be Chuck Taylor's going to have a 6-month period at the Center of Democratic Studies, and I'll be the 4 months right before him. And we're all working together and talking, so it may be a group speak, which would be too bad. But do I accept principal distance? Yes. What does principal distance mean? And why? It's important because this is why Mahatma Gandhi could never accept American type of secularism. I consider French secularism as a freedom of the state from religion. American secularism is to some extent freedom of religion from the state. Now, it is such a strong freedom of religion from the state that everyone wants. It's not necessarily that they were against religion. It's just you were about 5 different established religions from the 13 states negotiating this. So, of course, they would say that the federal government shall make no law, because everyone was worried that they would favor some establishment that wasn't theirs. But so they didn't want the central government to have this. But the key thing here is that why Gandhi? If you go to Tamil Nadu, you know there's a museum for Mahatma Gandhi. And it's a museum for his viz from about 1908 to about 1935. He came 14 times or something like that. Every time he came, and they have all these marvelous photographs and recordings and so on, and every time he came, it was for one issue, fundamentally. Temple entry rights for untouchables. And Tamil Nadu had people who were unseeable. You had to walk backwards and rake your sandprints off so no one could be seen. And so someone else was there as a beater of you if you didn't. So he just felt this was a horrible violation of citizenship. And if India ever became independent, people would have a right, untouchables, there wouldn't be untouchables. You would abolish that. So the democratic state could intervene in religious affairs if religious affairs were violating citizens' rights. That's principal distance. It doesn't mean you're always equal distance. It means if any other religions is systematically violating other people's rights, a democratic state should talk about this and try to act in such a way. So, and I think Gandhi was absolutely right. I've talked to a number of constitutional lawyers in the United States whether we could have done the Temple Entry Acts. They don't. Some say maybe, but they're not sure. They don't think we could have. And basically, it's the laws that went through was if you don't open up your temple to untouchables, we're going to close your entire directorate, and we're going to close that place, and it's only going to open up when you have a directorate that lets them in. Because, and Gandhi talked about it. He says, hey, religion is a public act. Hindus, we Hindus, celebrate our religion in some public way. And if you're not going to allow them into the places to celebrate their religion or to drink water within 3 miles of it, then that's not free exercise of Hinduism. So you're violating their religious rights, and we will close you. That's principal distance. And I can give you 5 or 10 others, but I think it's totally appropriate in a democracy. It doesn't make me a communitarian, I think.
Raises the question, or at least open the question that you sort of sought to address. Do Christian democratic parties, does their experience travel to the non-Western world? And do they travel to the non-Western world if the context and the actors are so different? And so my question to you is, in what way are the contexts and the actors different? If you had to sort of draw this, I have my own sort of sense of how the contexts are different and how it limits the model that you are suggesting. I was wondering what your assessment of the context and the actors and the differences in the experience are.
Yes, thank you. The interesting thing about Huntington is that in almost every argument you can have a Huntington side on one side of the argument and a Huntington side on the other, on the opposite. And in this particular one, Huntington has made the claim about the so-called participation incorporation logic, in which once you incorporate political forces which are outside the political system, you moderate them. So you can find him on the other side as well. But for some reason, he didn't apply that analysis when he wrote the other project. In terms of the second part of the question, yes, absolutely. You can think of the context as being different in many different ways. But I think the productive way to think is to take a framework such as that and see how and to what extent a different context affects as a parameter those different sequences. So, for example, you may say, well, the world, Europe in the 19th century is an industrializing continent, and that has a number of implications. For example, there is economic growth, which you may not find in countries in which there is economic stagnation. So there are opportunities that open up for social actors. Another difference would be to say that in the context of an industrializing continent in the 19th century, not only the development of religious mobilization, but also the development of working class labor mobilization. So that creates 2 different poles, and that may affect the calculations of the incumbent regime differently vis-a-vis a situation in which the incumbent regime only faces one opposition as opposed to 2. Now the question is, can you take those things and translate them into specific aspects that may change the calculus of the thinker? So to give you an example, if you think about the calculus of the incumbents when they face an opposition and to what extent they would be open to make concessions as opposed to not making concessions, you can say in an industrializing situation, there is an opportunity to make concessions because the pie grows and you may be able to distribute things. It's not a zero-sum game. Whereas in a situation in which there is economic stagnation and most of the revenues are derived from the state and the state's use of the resources, then you don't want to divide things up. And that's consistent with the idea that there is a correlation between GDP per capita and regime type. At the same time, you can see that things work in the opposite direction as well. You may say that, well, in continental Europe in the 19th century, it's generally fine to have a regime change in a more authoritarian direction. Nobody is going to argue against that. If you take the example of Germany, it's a hybrid regime. You have elections, but at the same time, you also have a lot of part of the institutions that are not democratic. It's not who wins the elections that rules. And you have a very violent attack against the rights of Catholics, which is called the Kulturkampf, the war of culture. So you have things that are accepted internationally. Nobody is going to contest the right of Germany to silence or to limit the rights of Catholics, whereas in today's world, if you do something like that, you are going to attract a lot more negative attention. So my point is that even though there are many differences, I think it's more productive to think of how these differences would translate into parameters that could push the calculations of those actors in one or another direction. I think that's a more interesting way to think as opposed to saying the world is the same or the world is totally different.
Professor Oppenheim.
Thank you, Teachers College. I wonder how you would place the struggles that occurred in French suburbs in the context of the various models that you've discussed today.
You could think of, on the one hand, there is this, the framework that has been used to analyze this situation is the framework of ethnic conflict. And it's interesting to think about that as opposed to religious mobilization. What is interesting in a situation of religious mobilization is you have organized social actors and political actors who aggregate grievances and mobilize people, but present those grievances in a way that is aggregated in the context of a political system, whereas the riots in Paris would be an expression of a more spontaneous, unrepresented group of people. So I would say, on the one hand, we have representation. It exists. The question is whether this representation finds its way to the political system. In the second case, we have a situation in which there is an absence of representation. It's much more spontaneous, as I said. And so the second issue would be whether you could, whether the framework of religious mobilization makes sense. You have a sense of exclusion. It's not clear to me that you have a sense of religious identity, even among people of the same religious denomination. And on top of it, it seems that you have a lot of religious diversity among people who are rioting. So it's not clear to me whether, I would imagine that it's much easier to incorporate these populations as second-generation immigrants than it would be to incorporate them on the basis of a religious identity. So I don't see how that framework would capture these dynamics.
I was in Paris at the time at Sciences Po, and a couple of things leading up to it had been a whole series of articles where there was a certain frustration. It wasn't necessarily religious per se, but it was, first of all, as you know, it's against the law to practice any form of affirmative action. The state cannot do it. It'd be against the law. You can go to jail, and if a private enterprise did. So you can't ask any questions on a census that would give you information like this. So this ideology of citizenship as the only identity is so strong that affirmative action is against the law. Okay, that's one thing. But then a couple of universities violated the French law by just sending out maybe 1,500 job applications where the person is identical, but you just change the street where they're living on or change one of their names so to indicate that they're North African. Boy, the chance of you getting a job, and then they even did it so your credentials are better, but you have that, and you just don't get a job. And it was just absolutely clean demonstration that there was systematic prejudice against the North African population. Now, so when the riots broke out, people kept expecting that a jihadist dimension or Islamic dimension. There weren't many Islamic symbols. What you had is the symbols of really angry young people on the outskirts. And even though the state, in the first instance, the current president called them scum, that wasn't the most helpful. But I don't think it was less religious than I thought it would be. I kept looking for it to be more religious, but I think the message was it was a deep form of the remark by one of the student leaders that struck me the most is, everyone tells me the only identity here is a Frenchman. Everyone tells me the only identity is a Frenchman. And you know what? They say I never can be a Frenchman. They wouldn't accept me as a Frenchman. So it was that existential anger, too. It's not necessarily only religious, but deep.
Professor Yalvan.
Since the subtitle of this conference is Turkey in a Comparative Perspective, and since we've got you on the subject of riots in France, may I respectfully ask the members of the panel to say something about, in comparison to France, about the Turkish minorities in Germany. because there seems to me to be a really great difference in the way they react as opposed to the Frenchman, the North African Frenchman. Is there?
Well, she's German. She's German.
Would anyone want to?
Mirjam, can we? we don't want to punish
it sounds as if the Germany has done a much better job than France in managing.
Address it to Mirjam. Ask her that. Is that fair?
I will only give a preliminary answer.
You're going to get a better answer.
I don't know if there's someone in the audience who has actually studied comparatively Muslim integration in Europe. I have not. But, oh, yes. Of course, the headscarf issue has also been discussed in Germany, right? And the educational system is a little bit different in that each one of the federal components in Germany has its own educational policies with regard to certain questions, and the headscarf issue is one of them. So 2 lenders in the south have decided to force Muslim teachers to veil, whereas the other lender have not, and students have also not been affected by this. So the forced veiling in public places, and in particular in schools, has not been instituted in Germany, but it has been instituted for teachers in Bayern and Baden-Württemberg in the south. Now, I cannot really speak to the question of whether Germany has done a better job with regard to the integration of the Muslim minority, because my own sense will only be anecdotal, how I experience it as a German, and there's a lot of criticism with regard to how Germany in so many ways has, of course, failed to integrate the Muslim minority. There have been a number of court cases recently with regard to domestic violence. One case of an honor murder. This was not a Turkish family. This was an Afghan family, actually. But I think many German families don't differentiate between immigrants from different Muslim majority countries. I think they tend to think of the problem of immigration rather as a whole. So, of course, the backlash has not been as violent as is the case in France, and economically also the minorities are not as disenfranchised, I think, as the North African minorities in Turkey, but there are a number of other challenges and problems. And I don't think that someone who would compare the two models of integration would really come to the conclusion that Germany has succeeded on a higher level than France has.
I can say 2 things. One is that there's a recent book from a religious perspective, not ethnic migration, but Muslims as a religious identity, written by Fetzer and Soper, Chris Soper and Jonathan Fetzer from Pepperdine. The title is Muslims and the State in Britain, Germany and France. And the argument, this was published by Cambridge University Press by 2 political scientists, and the argument is that among the 3, United Kingdom is the most successful in terms of integrating Muslims with regard to 3 policies: allowing religious symbols in schools, allowing religious instruction in schools, and allowing mosque construction. So France is the worst case, and Germany in between. And the explanation is that the French laïcité, with laïcité de combat, combative secularism, provide. So the argument is that each of the 3 treat Muslims with regard to their historical institutional background of their treatment of majority Christian population. So with the background of combative secularism, France didn't treat well Muslims. With the referring to the Anglican establishment in England, Muslims gained more rights there. And with the German system of dealing with Christians in between, Muslim treatment is between. And I have a recent article analyzing French exceptionalism. The idea is that although there are anti-immigrant Islamophobic movements in all European countries, why do we see that, as Mirjam emphasized, France is the only exception with banning headscarf in public school? And the argument is that in France there happens an unusual coalition of leftist assertive secularists and rightist anti-immigrant Islamophobics that it is hard to find such a coalition in other European countries.
If
just interject? It's a very interesting argument, but it doesn't seem to fit with the outcomes, because both Britain and France have exhibited riots, much more than Germany, if I'm not incorrect. And also in terms of Muslim participation in terrorist activities, it's much more likely in Britain, to a lesser extent in France, but not in Germany.
Yeah. Maybe Muslims there are spoiled. When they are given something, they want more.
We had a question in the back. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Antonio Avalos, Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. I want to say, first of all, thank you to every one of you because of your conferences and lectures. But I have a question to Stathis Kalyvas. Referring the path you are following to say that maybe the international pressure is something that is explaining more or less the situation of AKP in Turkey, why are you considering that religion in the case of Turkey is decentralized? Considering that the last 5 centuries, all the experiences are addressing normally to some kind of centralization, is the institutionally talking, at least from the recognition of the millet for every religion. And in the case of the new experiences, like the Fethullah Gulen movement, you can say that is something like, of course. Then I think that maybe it's not enough to say that the international pressure is the only explanation because AKP is in this place nowadays, but also the social roots and how it was built, this party, maybe is more important, and make that Turkey is not an exception.
Turkey is not?
It's not an exception, maybe, considering the European countries.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that seems to matter, and again, I'm speaking not as a specialist of Turkey, but it would seem that the party has established a very effective, the leadership of the party has established a very effective ability to chart its policy and then enforce it, so that you don't seem to get contradictory messages from the party. Whereas if you look at the experience of the FIS in Algeria, there was a tremendous inability to get the party to speak in one voice. And so it may be that in this context, where the party itself cannot really assume that position, then it is helpful to have an outside organization step in it. And in that case, if you don't have it, it's bad. But if you can manage to do that for yourself, then obviously the absence of an outside organization or its presence may be irrelevant.
I think at this point, if I could take the liberty of saying why don't we wrap it up in here and move into the other room where people can ask individual panelists questions and they can get a refreshment, and I think that'll be a little bit more low-key. Once again, I would like to thank all of our panelists and our hosts. Very intriguing.